Our first panel is called Neurotechnology and Consciousness. I will briefly introduce the speakers. Otherwise, most of the time, Michael will do the introducing. So our first speaker will be Luke Roelofs from the University of Texas at Arlington. Luke is a philosopher at the University of Texas in Arlington, interested in how conscious beings relate to each other. Their first book, Combining Minds, defends the possibility of composite minds that contain other minds as component parts. Their second book, Empathic Reason, tries to ground moral objectivity in the role of empathy in understanding other minds. Our second speaker will be our very own Michael Hegarty, right? That's the order we agreed on. Michael Hegarty is our postdoctoral research fellow at the Applied Ethics Center and at the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technology. He got his PhD in philosophy from UConn in 2025. Michael works mainly in the philosophy of mind and the philosophy of cognitive sciences, with a particular focus on understanding the continuities and discontinuities between animal and human minds. By drawing on a wide range of work in philosophy and science, including cognitive ethology, comparative psychology, neo-Kantian philosophy, and contemporary philosophy of mind, Michael has argued for a limited form of self-consciousness in non-human animals. His work has appeared in Erkenthesis and Res Philosophica, among other journals. He holds a graduate certificate in cognitive science from the University of Connecticut, an MA in history and philosophy of science from Leiden University, and an undergraduate and research master's degrees in chemistry from the University of Oxford. And our third speaker is going to be Brian Edlow from Mass General Hospital in Harvard. Dr. Edlow received his bachelor's from Princeton and MD from the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. He completed an internal medicine internship at Brigham here in Boston, followed by a neurology residency, NIH-funded neuroimaging fellowship, and neurocritical care fellowship at Mass General and Brigham. Dr. Edlow is currently a critical care neurologist at Mass General Hospital, vice chair of research at Mass General Brigham Neurology, and associate professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School. He's the founding director of the MGH Emerging Consciousness Program and associate director of the Center for Neurotechnology and Neurorecovery. We'll do about 15 minutes each presentation, followed by hopefully 15 minutes to half an hour of Q&A. So, please.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction. Okay, there we are. Apologies for the slightly 19th century sounding title here, 5 Theses on the Philosophy of Neurotechnology. Essentially, I am just going to kind of outline how I, as a philosopher, came to be interested in neurotechnology, including, in particular, brain-computer interfaces. It's going to be fairly abstract. I'm kind of zooming out to look at things in a kind of very broad perspective, as represented by the first thesis, kind of grand-sounding, that neurotechnology blurs the boundaries of the individual mind. That's kind of fundamentally why it seems to me really interesting to study and investigate. I'm not involved in clinical practice. I'm kind of coming at it because I'm just someone with a mind who kind of wants to know what are those. There is, of course, some interesting practical upshot to that. This blurring has the potential to lead to radically new forms of life, forms of mental existence. If we look at things on a fairly long historical time frame, not necessarily next year, but maybe at some point next century. And I also am inclined to think that this potential for these kind of radical new forms of life is not inherently either utopian or dystopian. Probably it's going to be just sort of complicated and confusing, the way that our current existence is. How it plays out depends at least as much on politics as on technology itself. And we can make at least some effort to theorize for these radical possibilities in advance by taking the concepts we rely on in everyday ethical and political life and trying to kind of figure out how they would work, how they would apply in a world of minds that are not bounded in the way that ours are. So my plan for the next 15 minutes or so is to basically just talk about each of those in a little bit more detail, not delving too much into anything too concrete or specific, but trying to kind of gesture at the large-scale possibilities that interest me. So first, what do I mean by saying that neurotechnology blurs the boundaries of the mind? Well, I'm kind of starting here from an observation about everyday life, which is that there is a big difference between how two mental processes, two thoughts or emotions or perceptions or plans or imaginings are going to interact with each other when they occur in the same person and when they occur over two people. That seems like a very basic observation that hopefully we're all pretty intimately familiar with. Just to give a couple of examples, if I'm feeling happy and sad, I'm likely to experience a kind of mingling of those feelings into a sort of bittersweet emotion. Whereas if I feel happy and you feel sad, that doesn't happen. Our feelings just kind of stay shut up in their own skin, so to speak. So that's a kind of an emotional example of this familiar observation. Here's a more logical one. If the thought, it would be good to get X, some goal, and the thought, doing Y will get X, occur at the same time to me, they will very likely lead directly to the logical implication of those two thoughts. It would be good to do Y. Whereas if I think it would be good to get X and you think doing Y will get X, again, that sort of interaction doesn't happen. We're not going to get that conclusion, at least unless we talk to each other. We interact physically, which seems, in everyday familiar terms, a very different kind of interaction. I have to deliberately choose to say something out loud. I activate some of my muscles. Sound waves travel through the air. You perceive them through your ears, and then you have to make various decisions about, how to understand me, how to interpret me, whether to believe me, and so on. And I think it's very natural to see a very fundamental difference there. Historically, philosophers have often thought that this difference between the interactions within my mind and the interactions between my mind and other people's are different at a very fundamental level. One is mental, maybe it happens in the immaterial soul, whereas the other is physical, right? If my soul wants to draw some logical conclusions from its thoughts, it just does that up in Soul Town. If it wants to get logical conclusions from your thoughts, it needs to take a detour down into the messy world of matter. And I think that even if we don't philosophically accept that kind of body-soul dualism, it is kind of natural to us. It's kind of there in the intuitions about how we live our lives. And this, in a way, almost is what I mean by the boundary of the mind. What is it for me to have a mind rather than two or three or half? It's for there to be a set of mental processes that all interact with one another in these characteristic ways. And we could give other examples. There's a lot of examples to explore there. But they don't interact with any of your mental processes in those ways. That's where the boundary of my mind stops. But scientifically, it turns out that fundamental divide isn't ultimately real. The processes between my So the interactions between my thoughts and yours, and between two of my thoughts, are ultimately about information being integrated within a complex physical system through encoding it into electromagnetic signals of some sort. Sound waves, neural firings are both ultimately changes in electromagnetic forces between molecules. The difference is real, but it's a difference of degree. And so what interests me about neurotechnology is that it is our slowly emerging ability to adjust those degrees, to take, for instance, an interaction between two people, say, oh, we're going to replace the talking bit with rapid radio communication between our two brain implants, change the speed, the richness, the degree of filtering, various factors to make it gradually approach or resemble the sorts of interactions that happen within my mind. Either to make my mind kind of communicate with yours in just the same way that happens within my mind, or to find some sort of interesting intermediate level that's kind of halfway there. So that's what I mean by saying that neurotechnology blurs the boundaries of the mind. And that, as I said, is very interesting to me theoretically. I think it also has some interesting practical upshots. Obviously, the keynote just now gave us a lot of very immediate, concrete, urgent practical upshots. I'm kind of interested in some of the longer-term, more radical upshots. For example, the possibility of creating barriers in the functioning within a single brain so that some mental processes within that brain can no longer interact with other mental processes in the way characteristic of what we normally think of as within one mind. One of my favorite TV shows, Severance, is kind of an example of a corporation using that ability to create multiple minds cohabiting within one body, and then dependent on the corporation's permission to get control over that body. The opposite process would be to somehow remove barriers between minds. If we could find some way that my thoughts and feelings could interact with those in another human being just as quickly, just as immediately, just as directly as they do with each other, we could create a kind of hive mind, one mind spread over many bodies. For a slightly more worrying kind of asymmetric example, if one mind can kind of intrude into the boundaries of another whenever it wants, without the other mind being able to push back or intrude back, you could get a kind of much more radical sort of domination than anything seen so far, where one person controls another's thoughts and feelings. And of course, these are just the kind of clean extremes, where I've sort of imagined things to an extreme. In practice, what we also might find is new patterns of interaction that might be intermediate between paradigmatic within mind and paradigmatic between mind models. And in that case, we might not even really be sure how many minds we're dealing with. There might be multiple equally good ways to count them. Now, I think when I describe these kind of radical possibilities, the easiest emotional response to have, that you kind of see, I think, coming out in science fiction a lot, is to either think, wow, this is some kind of transcendent, quasi-religious apotheosis, a singularity after which all our familiar human sins and imperfections will fall away, or to view it as a kind of terrifying dystopian threat to everything we value. This is the Borg from Star Trek, who are just one of many imperialistic hive minds that stalk our imagination. Sometimes, I think at best, you get an uncanny combination of the two. This is a marketing image from Pluribus, one of my recent favorite TV shows, about global hive minds and the people who love them. And one of the fun things about Pluribus is that on some level, the hive mind functions as an antagonist, but it also really tries to present itself as a partner, as a positive development, and it makes various ethical arguments in its own support. Now, my thinking here, soberly, when I'm not writing science fiction, is that both of these impulses are probably mistaken. Even if we were to live in radically new forms of kind of mental organization, that would probably just mean new forms of conflict and cooperation, new sorts of imperfection and compromise. So I've been arguing with people recently over Pluribus that there can be good and bad hive minds. Like, not all hive minds are necessarily going to be menaces. There could be unjust or just ways for the innies and outies and severance to kind of reckon and coordinate their shared life. How exactly it plays out, fourth thesis here, depends on politics, not just technology. Technology gives us new possibilities, but doesn't by itself determine how we use it. And I think, there are people, some people right now in Silicon Valley who are kind of see the technology as almost a way out of politics. If you can just kind of push fast enough towards sufficient technological achievement, then debates between Republicans and Democrats will seem obsolete and irrelevant. And I kind of feel the opposite. Neurotechnology in particular, and although a lot of this applies also to artificial intelligence, could be used for good or evil. It could expand people's ability to express love, to intimately connect with others, but also expand people's ability to abuse and manipulate each other. It could expand institutions' capacity to coordinate democratically, or their capacity to manipulate and control their customers. And it's not just the kind of obvious point that technology is a form of power, and so we should be attentive to who we're empowering at a given moment. It's also that even if we empower the right people, or the people who deserve to have power, we really need to build structures that would incentivize good uses and restrict bad ones. We just like for any form of new social organization, there are going to be bad and good outcomes, and we should want to have a way for people to be steered towards the good ones. And of course, decisions about implementation are the product of the pre-existing power structure. So whoever we empower with technology A right now determines who's going to be able to make these decisions about technology B 5 years down the line. Final thesis. This is kind of where I guess I see my own research fitting in a little bit. There are some things that I think we probably can't do very far in advance. So I don't think we can predict the exact outcomes of a new technology more than a few years kind of ahead of actually seeing it in practice. Consequently, I don't think we can devise effective and concrete ways to make them safe and democratic, in advance of actually seeing how they work. Too much depends on the details, including details about us that new technology reveals. One of the fascinating things about any new technology is what we learn about humans from seeing how they use it and what it does to them. I don't think it's our job right now to try and write constitutions for hive minds. But I do think that there's a kind of room for foundational conceptual research that focuses on expanding our theoretical framework. So the thought here is something like, we have all these familiar concepts that we care about: rights, self-determination, intimacy, agency, responsibility, death, survival, all of these. And the way that they're usually defined and operationalized presupposes minds with clear boundaries, presupposes that we know what is your mind and what is mine and where is the line between them. And that's going to make them somewhat less useful if we do encounter situations with blurred boundaries between minds. The concepts may contradict themselves, break down, become arbitrary. And so I think philosophical reflection can usefully aim at taking concepts like these and trying to ask, well, what would this mean if we didn't know how many minds we were dealing with? For instance, just as an example, a paper I have forthcoming is on the concept of communication as opposed to the kind of introspective processes where you kind of talk to yourself. And it tries to ask, if we didn't know how many minds were in a situation, how would we tell whether a given information signaling process was more like communication or more like a kind of internal introspective reflection? I think I probably don't have time to show you the spectrum diagrams that I have for that, but I'm happy to talk about that or other examples in the Q&A. But yeah, that's kind of basically how I think about the philosophy of neurotechnology, and I think Michael's talk on agency is kind of one really useful example of this, delving into what does agency mean when we are kind of blurring the bodily boundaries of our equipment. But at this point, I think I'll just hand over right to Michael. Thank you.
And thank you for the nice allusion from your talk to mine, Luke. That's entirely right. I want to, ask a question about how ought we to understand agency in BCI type contexts. So it's a very concrete kind of, here's one single example I'm drawing on just a couple of papers, but the example is an exoskeleton orthosis. So could be used in a clinical setting for somebody to control with their thoughts, in some sense, an arm that perhaps is paralyzed, but it goes through this mechanical device that is not, of course, part of your usual body. And the question then is, how ought we to understand this? I'm doing something mentally and acting in the world also. Is this an ordinary type of action, or is it something different? And I will try and talk about, is this just brain-computer interfaces allow subjects to control external systems through thought? Now, consider one example, a robotic arm orthosis, or RAO, controlled by the user through a wearable BCI that collects EEG signals. Subjects can learn to move the arm to succeed in simple tasks, such as taking drinks of water. What should we make of this case? Is the movement of the robotic arm an action performed by the thinking subject? If it is, then is it a special kind of action that differs from ordinary embodied action? What makes this different from ordinary embodied actions or the usage of tools, we might wonder? So, to do this, we need to fix some kind of agency. A very popular one, and I'm not necessarily endorsing this, is the causal theory of action. The account's supposed to capture the ordinary sense in which reasons are explanations of action, which events in the world are intentional actions, and which are not. Reflections of sunlight are events, but seem not to be intentional, whereas things that we impute to each other that we do are intentional. Wherein lies the difference? On a simple version of this causal theory, the right mental states cause action. That's what an action is, to be caused by, just to give one version of the theory, a belief-desire pair. So I pick up the water glass because I want to take a drink, and I believe that this urge will be satisfied if I drink from the glass. An event is an intentional action in virtue of being caused by this belief-desire pair that explains the action. That's the causal theory in a nutshell. Believing and desiring are not themselves actions. They're mental states. So the causal theory also makes this distinction between basic actions. So the idea is my thoughts cause a bodily movement. The bodily movement is an action, the thought causing it, the belief-desire pair is not. Further down the causal chain, I can use my bodily movement to do stuff, like drink the water. So the immediate effect of my thought is a basic action, as they say, and further down the line, if I use my basic actions to do other stuff in the world, the causal theory calls these non-basic actions. Okay, this is essential background to asking this question: is the orthotic arm movement an ordinary action or not? Okay. So the causal theory also has it that the belief-desire pair causes an action. I was talking about it rationalizes it previously, but it causes it. How is it supposed to do that? The developer of this theory, Donald Davidson, is thinking of beliefs and desires from folk psychology. So they're supposed to be ordinary mental states that we attribute to each other. Why did John go to the concert? He wanted to go there. We're attributing thoughts to John. The causal theory is supposed to capture how actions are caused by those sorts of things. But how exactly are beliefs and desires mental states? How exactly are beliefs and desires, which are mental states, how do mental states cause action? A popular and respectable answer involves a functionalism about mental states. Roughly, believing something is manifest in your dispositions to think and act. What you believe is going to impact what you do and what you say and what you think. So, the belief is identified with a causal role. Whatever, me believing there's beer in the fridge has an impact on how I behave towards the fridge, especially under conditions when I feel like a beer. Okay, and the causal role is supposed to be realized. We're talking about mental states, not clear that those are physical, but if you're a functionalist, you can say, well, these mental states are ultimately physical stuff, probably in your nervous system. Is a popular way to think of that. I'm not endorsing that either, but it's popular. Then the physical stuff in your head, realizing the belief, can just interact mechanically. You can explain that neurophysiologically or otherwise, I suppose, is the hope. And this in turn mechanistically produces bodily movements. So this is cool because philosopher of AI, Nick Bostrom, who's quite well known, has popularized this idea of substrate independence, he calls it. So if you want to to entertain the possibility that a computer could have a mind, it's quite helpful if you adopt a functionalist idea of what a mind is, because then it doesn't matter. The function of what a belief is can be instantiated in a computer or a clockwork device, as long as you can capture that functional role. So you can see, hopefully, that if you want to entertain the possibility that non-biological creatures could have minds, this is a nice way to go. Okay. All right, so a return to arms, to our issue, our example. We've got a couple of things on the table from the causal theory of action and this idea of functional mental states. So, in one paper, Steinert et al. Claim the striking peculiarity of BCI technology is that the kind of actions it enables seem to differ from paradigmatic human actions because effects in the world are brought about by devices such as robotic arms, prosthesis, or other machines, and their execution runs through a computer directed by brain signals. They're very impressed by this. In contrast to usual forms of action, the sequence does not need to involve bodily or muscle movements at all. A motionless body, the epitome of an action, might be acting. I'm not sure that last claim is scientifically accurate, but nevertheless. And here they say again, second quotation, BCIs create a new output channel to interact with the world, bypassing the muscular system of the body. Okay. So this is the basis for why they think BCI-mediated events are so different from ordinary actions. I'm wondering, are they that different? I'm going to take the causal theory as the framework within which to pose and answer that question. The answer is no, they're not different. Okay. So, Steiner wants to claim the following weirdness for BCI-mediated events. An action with identical effects, this, I'm quoting them, say an arm reaching for a glass, is a basic action under natural circumstances, that is, non-BCI contexts, but a non-basic action when it's facilitated by a BCI prosthesis. So here's the basic, non-basic distinction. It's crucial to why they think these things are very weird and not like ordinary action. In the ordinary case, I have mental states, my arm moves, I drink the water. My arm movement is supposed to be a basic action here because it is what is caused by my mental states. They're saying in the BCI case, you have an extra step. You have a thought, then you don't have the muscle movements, but you do have a command that moves a robotic arm. This is what they say is the third peculiarity of BCI actions. So, because the robotic arm is being moved, they think that this is a non-basic action. Okay, let's see if this claim stands up. So the causal theory, remember, states that some event is an action if and only if it's caused by the right kind of mental state, perhaps a belief-desire pair, although there are other options here. All right, so what are the subjects in the BCI case thinking when they move the robotic arm? This is going to be crucial, of course. In the usual case, we're supposed to have beliefs and desires producing movements. Is that what these BCI patients are thinking to get these robotic arms to move? No. There's disagreement about this, but and it depends on how you actually set up the BCI, how you configure it to respond to translate brain data to signals. Okay. But a typical way subjects move these robotic arms, these orthoses, is by imagining their own arms moving in the ways they want the robotic arm to move. And with some practice, by doing this, they can drink the water using the robotic arm there. So they've got this orthosis on them, and they, while letting the muscles in their arm go limp, because these are not actually patients with clinical pathologies, they're able to raise their arm by imagining motor movements and drinking water, which is obviously very cool. But is it any different, appreciably, on the causal theory to regular action? So the alleged weirdness, I think, is based on a misunderstanding in action theory and philosophy of mind. Did I skip a piece here? Okay, just go back one slide. So Steiner et al. Accept that motor imagery causes action. They think motor imagery itself is itself an action, a kind of mental action. You don't really choose what you believe. It's not an action, but I choose to imagine my arm moving. So this is where their argument, they're saying because it's effortful, it's a mental action to imagine my arm moving when it isn't, then an action causes the action involving the robotic arm, so it must be non-basic. Okay? And so they want to claim that motor imagery causes action on the causal theory, and that motor imagery is itself an action. But on the causal theory, mental states, not actions, cause actions. So they're endorsing a contradiction here. They're trying to say mental imagery is both an action and a non-action, but it can't be both. Indeed, it's not hard to think through that one's imagining a certain bodily movement is something I do because I have some prior desires or intentions to do that. So it seems like if you are a causal theorist, you ought to be saying the mental imagery itself is a basic action of some sort, a mental action perhaps. Okay. So I think that they're saying the BCI arm movement is very different. I don't think it is, at least not in the causal theory. It's based on this misunderstanding of action theory and philosophy of mind. They want to make much of the fact that the robotic arm movement is facilitated by a direct connection, they say, with the mind or brain of the subject, depending on if we see those as non-identical. They need a way to distinguish from direct and from indirect connection here, because they're saying what makes this weird? It has direct connection to your mind, even though it's a non-basic action. That's why it's weird. But can we draw a distinction between direct and indirect control on the causal theory? Well, we have to find a place where there could be a difference grounding that distinction. It can't be a difference in the causing mental states. That would take you away from being a causal theorist. If you have causation by the right mental states, then you have a basic action. That's what the theory says. That's consistent with a nice materialist, functionalist picture of the mind. If you want to believe in the physical world and put minds in there, the functional idea of mind is quite helpful. Okay, but there's a tension here. Compare tool use. I cut the grass with my lawnmower. I'm cutting the grass. My body is here, part of the causal chain initiated by my beliefs and desires. From the perspective of causation and the causal theory, my bodily movements that are the links in the causal chain are no different from the electrochemical movements of the lawnmower. And this is philosophically important because it's a backstop against something else that Luke mentioned, sort of Cartesian dualism, the idea that mind is its own special kind of non-physical stuff. Functionalism is supposed to be a way of not doing that if we think the world is all physical. Again, I'm not committing to any of this. I'm just suggesting these concepts that Steiner et al. Are forcing together don't play nicely. Okay. So if we want to be materialists, we must deny that there is non-physical mental stuff. And the metaphysics of functionalism says that some physical states are also mental states because they realize causal functional roles. Where in this picture can we distinguish direct and indirect control? Not in the mental states, and not in the causal chain, because the causal chain is quite irrelevant once it's been caused by the right mental states, whether it goes through a bunch of robotic stuff or body stuff is quite irrelevant. And there isn't anywhere else to look, unless perhaps we go accidentally postulating occult inner causes that do have this immaterial Cartesian dualist flavor, which seems to be what Steiner et al. Do, but they don't realize they're doing it. Okay. So they end up postulating something they call an executory command. They say, and quoting them, people have many desires, beliefs, and intentions in which they do not act. Something additional has to come in to realize such intentions. And an executory command, often it's called a volition. Okay. But the role described of causing is supposed to be the role played by the belief-desire pair in the causal theory. Philosophers of action who don't like the causal theory do complain that it has no room for an actual agent, a me that is doing the causing, that doing the acting. The causal chain view, some say, reduces actions to things that happen to you, whereas what we wanted to explain was how are you the agent of your actions? What they call agent causation gets postulated to solve this problem. But so it sounds like Steiner et al. Are just postulating a kind of agent causation here, but that's a key objection to the causal theory. So they can't claim this without really giving up their view. Okay. So what's gone wrong here? They say a surprising peculiarity of BCIs is that users have to give a go command via the respective mental action. This is surprising. This is surprising only if you're expecting BCI mediated events to be analogous to bodily actions. And it's not surprising if they're tools. I do have to give a sort of mental command to myself if I'm going to operate the car or whatever. And as Steiner et al. Cannot make good on the promised specialness of BCI-mediated events within the causal theory, I think the BCI case is just a slightly exotic case of tool use, at least on the causal theory. Okay, so my concluding remarks here. So what I've tried to do is, first, there's a tension in Steiner et al. On the one hand, they're very impressed by the idea of mental action at a distance, but this requires a strict separation between mind and body, it looks like. Certainly seems to if you put it that way, but I've tried to show philosophically they're kind of smuggling in this distinction and they don't realize they're doing it and they probably don't want to be doing it. On the other hand, the materialist functionalist picture underlying most work in AI, etc., exists precisely to deny this strict separation between mind and body. So they don't realize they're in the grip of a Cartesian dualist picture that is incompatible with some basic philosophical commitments that are useful if you want to think about technology and minds. Okay. So last thing, it looks like we've got a collision here, a tension between our intuitions about the specialness of artificial systems, as exemplified by the BCI case, and functionalist materialism. Presumably, most people writing in AI really want to be functionalist materialists. I've read a lot of that literature. Typically, this is presupposed. But Steiner et al. Show how easy it is to slip up into taking an unstable position or possibly committing to some stuff that they really don't want to commit to. So, the problem is they're engaging somewhat shallowly with the action theory. They don't quite see this. So, as a methodological recommendation, I suggest to pay more careful attention to very difficult but existing and complex literatures in philosophy of mind and action. That's essential if we're going to make a unified transdisciplinary effort to understand the sorts of changes that these technologies might wring on humanity. Thank you.
My name is Brian Edlow, here from the Mass General Hospital Neurocritical Care Division. It's an honor to be participating in today's symposium. The title of my brief talk is Searching for Consciousness in the ICU. The work that our lab is performing is funded by a variety of federal, foundation, and institutional sources, and I have no financial disclosures or conflicts of interest to report. There are three objectives for today's talk. First, we'll discuss the clinical motivation for the development of advanced neurotechnologies aimed at detecting and predicting recovery of consciousness in the ICU. Second, the impact that these advanced neurotechnologies are already having on patient care. And then finally, we'll consider some future directions, a theme that was highlighted earlier in Dr. Young's talk: how do we disseminate or democratize these advanced neurotechnologies? Traumatic coma. This is the challenge we face every day in the ICU, prognosticating for patients like this young man, Doug. All of the photos and the stories that I'm telling here are done with consent. This was the first patient I took care of as a medical student at University of Pennsylvania back in 2006. He had been hit by a car, a hit and run, as a cyclist for his college cycling team. He was at Drexel. These are photos that his family took of the crash scene. That's his bike after getting hit. This is Doug in the ICU. He was comatose for 14 days. Every day I pre-rounded on him as a med student. You're getting there 4:30 or 5 a.m., squeeze my hand, wiggle your toes, no volitional movement. We sit down and we speak with his parents, and the clinical team tells them that he will likely die in the ICU, or if he survives, he will probably end up in a persistent vegetative state. And that incredibly pessimistic prognosis was based upon this image, a low-resolution, axial or cross-sectional picture of his brain taken on day 7 with an MRI scan, where each of these dark areas indicated by the red arrows indicate bleeding, torn blood vessels in his brain. And the inference here is that if the blood vessels were torn at the moment of impact, there are probably nearby torn axons, the parts of the brain cells that send the electrical signals, thereby disconnecting his neural networks and making it unlikely that he will recover consciousness. Of particular prognostic importance was this lesion shown here in the brain stem, the part of the brain that is like a battery that sends ascending signals to activate the rest of the brain, the cortex in particular. Because of the lesion in the brain stem, we felt that there was a low likelihood he would ever recover consciousness. On day 14, he squeezes my hand for the first time, a moment that gave me chills at the time and continues till this day, even though I've had the privilege of being present for dozens of transitions like that from coma to consciousness. And ultimately, after a lengthy inpatient and outpatient rehabilitation over many years, he gets back on his bike and rides coast to coast from California to West Philly. He gets right back to the precise spot where he got hit, put his Drexel uniform back on, and took a picture saying, "I'm here, I did it, I recovered." So how did we get it so wrong as clinicians? What did we miss? Why did we misguide his family? Thankfully, they continued with aggressive life-sustaining therapy, but many families do not. The number one cause, by far, 70 to 80% of deaths in the ICU for patients with a severe traumatic brain injury are because of the withdrawal of life-sustaining therapy. And the number one reason that families withdraw life-sustaining therapy is because of our prognostication, how we communicate to them. So let's talk about diagnosis. How do we detect the early emergence of consciousness so that we can give families more accurate information about their loved one's chances of recovery? You may have heard of the Glasgow Coma Scale score, or the GCS. Certainly the clinicians in this room are familiar with this. This was developed back in the 1970s for the rapid assessment of consciousness. Here in the illustration, we see the clinician pinching the patient's finger. This is a 30 to 60 second evaluation that was designed to guide emergent decision making. Does this patient need to be crashed to the operating room to take off part of their skull to reduce pressure within the brain? Do they need a pressure monitor like the one shown here in the illustration? Now let's imagine that we, the experts, go into a patient's room in the intensive care unit today. We do this assessment, and we come out and we say, his eyes were open, as shown here in the illustration, but no evidence of purposeful behavior, no evidence of awareness of self or the environment. It looks like he's in a vegetative state. If we then go back in the room and perform a more comprehensive behavioral assessment that takes about a half hour, not always possible in a critically ill patient who sometimes can't remain stable off of sedation for that long, but when it is possible, if we can perform this longer bedside behavioral evaluation, 40% of the time, we will detect evidence of consciousness that was missed on that initial exam. Now let's imagine that we can place earphones in the ears of each one of these patients, send them to the MRI scanner for a functional MRI, where we ask them to imagine that they're performing a task, like a motor imagery task, as alluded to in the earlier talks. Work by our groups and others around the world have shown that about 15 to 20% of the time, the most recent data from an international study published in the New England Journal suggests this number may be as high as 25%. 1 in 4 patients who appear unresponsive, even on the comprehensive behavioral assessment, will show you that they were trying to do that motor imagery task. They are purposefully modulating their brain activity, showing you signs of consciousness, although we can certainly debate whether this is evidence of consciousness or not in the Q&A. This phenomenon, first described in 2006, our group identified it for the first time in the ICU in 2017, is commonly referred to as covert consciousness, meaning it cannot be detected based on the overt motor expression of a patient. So why does it matter? Why do we need to get the diagnosis right in the ICU? In other words, is diagnosis relevant to prognosis? 2 decades of research have shown that the overt behavioral signs of consciousness early in the ICU, giving a thumbs up, wiggling your toes, that predicts long-term functional recovery, communication, return to work or school. And a landmark study published by our colleagues at Columbia showed that covert consciousness similarly predicts long-term recovery. This group used EEG, so a standard clinical electrode setup in the ICU. Here, what we're looking at in the orange are healthy controls, like you and me, modulating their brain activity during a motor imagery task. And in blue are the 15% of over 100 ICU patients who could similarly modulate their brain activity as detected by EEG during a motor imagery task. And the key finding here that shook our field was that the odds of recovering functional independence 1 year later were 4.6 times higher if you could do this task, if you could show evidence of covert consciousness in the ICU as compared to those who could not. The impact on patient care of these advanced technologies has been dramatic. In 2018, clinical guidelines are published in the United States where, for the first time, task-based EEG and functional MRI were endorsed as part of routine clinical care. Transitioning to 2020, the European Academy of Neurology puts out its guidelines for clinical care of patients with severe brain injuries and disorders of consciousness, and they too endorse a multimodal approach to detecting and predicting recovery of consciousness. And I'd like to quote the authors of these guidelines because it represents such a sea change in our field. They state that, in conclusion, standardized clinical rating scales, EEG-based techniques, and functional neuroimaging should be integrated into a composite reference standard. This means that a given patient should be diagnosed with the highest level of consciousness as revealed by any of the three approaches. Dr. Young and I, other clinicians in this room, many of us were trained to think of the evaluation of consciousness as proceeding along two axes, those of overt motoric function and overt expression of volitional cognitive behavior. But we're now being asked to consider a third axis, that of covert function, as assessed with EEG or fMRI, as shown here. And this is the old school model of two dimensions, overt cognition and motoric function, now the modern model of a third axis that we're being encouraged to consider. Dr. Young and I and our team of collaborators at Mass General Hospital developed a clinical program based on the guidelines published in the US in 2018 and Europe in 2020 called the Emerging Consciousness Program. What you're looking at on this slide is the header from a paper we published, just sharing with our community all of the lessons learned, many barriers faced, many failures along the way, but trying to disseminate our lessons and the techniques that can be applied for clinical care in a guideline concordant manner. The fMRI and EEG data shown at the bottom of this slide, there is nothing special about them compared to the many research papers that came before. The only noteworthy thing is that these investigations were done for clinical purposes only. We have had, I hope, at this point, a global impact insofar as we have rolled out these techniques to multiple states within the US, as well as over 14 countries internationally, in some cases with patients being flown to our center for access to these techniques. In other cases, Dr. Young and I and our team will perform consultations remotely, and if the technologies are not available, we'll provide counseling about the most appropriate way to assess and predict recovery of consciousness in the absence of these techniques. Moving forward, some future directions that I'd like to highlight that will hopefully spark some conversation during the Q&A. A particularly promising technique that appears to have better performance characteristics as far as its accuracy for detecting signs of consciousness, even than the advanced neurotechnologies we've discussed thus far, task-based fMRI and EEG. This particularly promising technique that many of us are calling a consciousness detector is called transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS EEG. And the idea is it's like you're throwing a pebble into a lake, where the TMS machine is emitting a magnetic pulse like a pebble, and then you are measuring with the EEG electrodes the electrical ripples like the waves in a lake. Here is a video showing what this looks like in the human brain over the first 300 milliseconds after emitting this magnetic pulse. We can watch these electrical ripples move throughout the brain, and the conceptual basis for this technique is that the more complex and the longer the duration of those ripples being observed, the more likely that patient is to be conscious. This is a technique that was developed by Marcello Massimini at University of Milan and brought over to our team in the United States by Dr. Matteo Fecchio. Here is Dr. Fecchio performing the first TMS EEG evaluation in an intensive care unit at our center at Mass General Hospital in Boston. And here are the types of images that it creates. What we are looking at are the electrical ripples moving over the surface of the brain, as shown here in orange, yellow, and red. And as those ripples travel over the surface of the brain, they are moving from one place to another, hemisphere to hemisphere, across the electrical wires, the axons. And we are visualizing in this technique the axons that are allowing the electrical signal to propagate. This is based on data an MRI scan and a TMS EEG experiment performed at 2 different times, but we figured out how to spatially align the imaging and the electrophysiology data so that we can probe the structural and the functional properties of human consciousness. The visualization technique was developed by a data analyst in our lab, Xander Edlow, who's now a grad student at Stanford, and this was recently featured in the cover of Brain Stimulation. What do we do once we identify signs of covert consciousness in a patient? Dr. Young talked earlier about the BrainGate study led by Lee Hochberg at Mass General Hospital, where to date, the patients who have been enrolled in this brain-computer interface study have been paralyzed but conscious, cognitively normal. Patients with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, or brainstem stroke, where we know that they have normal cognition, but they have limited or absent motoric output. And here is one such patient with ALS, where he is controlling a mouse to surf the internet. These types of techniques have been used to control robotic arms, as was mentioned earlier. This individual was cognitively normal. Now, our patients in the ICU, they've got a brain injury, but we are finding evidence that they have higher levels of cognition than they do of motoric expression. So can we enable them, can we give them the opportunity to express themselves with this type of technique where we implant a microelectrode, as shown here, smaller than FDR's head and a dime? In order to facilitate this process, we're now writing grants to launch these types of studies. We have developed some brain mapping techniques to provide personalized connectivity maps of each patient's brain. Because when the brain is injured, the key neural networks that we're targeting with these microelectrodes, they can remap and they can reorganize themselves. Here we're looking at a new development, a device that could be used by neurosurgeons intraoperatively, where in real time a surgeon could identify the precise location on the surface of the brain that would be an optimal target for the placement of this electrode. And this is part of a large collaboration between the radiology department, neurology, and neurosurgery department at Mass General Hospital. What this means is that what was once considered science fiction back when Doug came into the ICU back in 2006 is becoming a scientific reality. Patients like Doug who come into our ICU today, we can perform TMS EEG to detect signs of consciousness based on these electrical ripples, the complexity of that response, alongside task-based fMRI and EEG techniques. We can then create these personalized brain maps to identify where we might place microelectrodes to allow somebody to express themselves using the BrainGate device. This is where we hope we're going over the next 5 to 10 years, perhaps even 2 to 3 years. To conclude, what is our responsibility to patients and families? We've already talked about how in the United States and Europe, multiple academic organizations and the government have endorsed these advanced neurotechnologies as part of clinical care. And it has been inspiring to see leaders in our field, like Dr. Young and like Joe Finns, whose book is shown here, talk about access to these neurotechnologies as a civil right, akin to the Disability Rights Treaty passed by the United Nations in 2008. Now, there are profound ethical questions at stake here about access, about dissemination of these techniques, and I look forward to having that discussion with all of you in the Q&A. So thank you for your attention, and happy to take any questions.
Technologies for patients who have neurological problems, that the people who were using those technologies may be overly influencing the communication process. And along the lines of what Dr. Wolfs proposed, that there may be intermediate states here between you communicating and somebody else thinking about it. How do you think about the way that this technology might over-interpret the consciousness of the patient?
Really appreciate the insightful question. Several components or layers that I'll do my best to address. The first, and this is an issue that I perhaps should have highlighted in greater detail, the first point to make is that these techniques are imperfect, like any other diagnostic or prognostic test that we use in the ICU. For example, if all of us in this room today were to undergo task-based functional MRI or EEG, 25% of us would have a false negative result, either because we're not trying hard enough, or we're not paying attention, or maybe we fell asleep in the MRI scanner, Or if you just try it, try to imagine opening and closing your hand without actually doing it. It's not easy. So there's a substantial false negative rate even in healthy controls. One corollary is that some have proposed that patients who can actually do these motor imagery tasks may have pretty high levels of cognition because of the sustained attention that's required to perform them. Nevertheless, as you pointed out, there are those in the field who are concerned that the use of assistive communication devices is being influenced by the caregivers, whether it's families or clinicians, almost like a Ouija board. And I have seen videos to this effect. I'm not going to name any specific cases or providers, but I've seen videos where patients who our team was absolutely convinced after a comprehensive evaluation that there was no evidence of purposeful brain activity based on behavior, imaging, or electrophysiology. Another team of clinicians say, look, this patient's using an assistive communication device. And I watched the videos and I was wholly not convinced. So I think it's incredibly important that we develop rigorous and objective assessment tools to ensure that families are not being given false hope, to ensure that there are massive investments of time, resources, and money that are made into these techniques. So, in some cases, families that don't have much resources may be convinced to invest in some fancy device because they're under the impression it works, when really it's not effective. How we create those robust and reliable and objective metrics of what's effective, I think, is incredibly challenging and is a whole other conversation. And if others have thoughts here, the field hasn't quite gotten there yet. Dr. Young, if you want to jump in here, I don't know if I'm allowed to phone a friend, but I'm not aware of a way to address your question yet, but we have to get there, because if the field's going to be applying these devices, we need to do so in a responsible way.
One thing, and maybe it relates to you too also, but Michael, I was just wondering whether you think that imagining a movement, for example, is the same if I'm just sitting in my thought process and I'm imagining a movement, as opposed to me trying to move a robotic arm with it, right? And so how, how a behavior can change when it becomes communicative, right? So our behavior changes all the time, ask Irving Goffman about us pretending to not be watched when we know we're being watched and our actions are different, right? And so now we're trying to, we know that controlling our brain, it's not really thought to device, right? It's thought corresponding to some kind of brain activity being read by device, translating into action. And we know that we have to make our brain do the thing that makes the thing do the thing, right? And so I am just wondering, so you were suggesting that it's not an act, that it's, and I could be persuaded it's not an act, but it's also not just a thought, right? It seems to have some kind of, it seems to transform through the task. And you can imagine this after you get the robotic arm feedback of it actually, so now you can perceive the arm actually doing what you say. You can almost skip this, right? So I just think that there is a lot of dynamics, and the thing is not the same when it has become habitual, and as we in sort of sensory motor cognition say, close the loop, right? So when the sensory feedback allows us to close the loop even without proprioception, and we don't have proprioception of our brain, right? But the imaginary is a very cool intermediary precisely because it has an experiential component, right? So there is a sort of closing the loop within, yes, I did imagine it. Yeah, yes, I did imagine it. So whereas I can't say, make my hippocampus go. I can't do that. So it's very few areas of the brain that I actually have an ability to close the loop, which you could see could invite people to say it's a kind of action, right? So.
It's a lot to respond to. Well, one thing that occurs to me is we have difficulty talking about these things because we, I think, are quite in the dark about the right conceptual apparatus to apply to the mind, and looking at a sensoromotor embodied perspective as opposed to the kind of traditional interior Cartesian sort of view that I was talking about. Those are very different ways of carving up what mental life is like, and we are not particularly close, it seems to me, to figuring out which of those or some third thing is the right way to go. So I'm agreeing with you. I think this shows that our categories are unsettled, and so I think that to address that, more kind of interdisciplinary, reflective equilibrium between philosophical thought from various angles, embodiment is important, I think, as well as with empirical work. Okay, Luke, do you want to say something on this?
Yeah. Turn it on? Okay. So, I mean, yeah, just to kind of pick up on one of the themes in the question, does it seem possible to you, at least given how you're thinking about action, that initially the movement of the prosthesis is a non-basic action because you do it by first imagining something, but that over time, as it becomes habitual, as you learn exactly what kind of inarticulate mental something makes it move, then it would become a basic action. Is that possible?
Thank you. I was certainly thinking of it in those terms, and I haven't quite thought through the very important question that you're raising about these are unusual things that we learn to do in a laboratory setting. Like it's important in these studies that they have to before they're let loose on the robotic arm, they have to be able to use the same kind of BCI to direct a cursor on a screen, and until they can do that successfully, they're not allowed to use the orthosis. So there's already a skill element that's necessary for them to even be able to do this. So I think it's quite and I was thinking of the comparison, trying to, learning to drive a car or any other kind of device, tool that can become second nature in a way. With that, I'm not sure exactly if I want to say we change the category of basic to non-basic action here or not, but it's certainly the skill element here is something I think is being under-theorized, and that's certainly important.
Hi, thanks for presenting, all of you. So I'm a psychotherapist, and I do a lot of thinking about the impact of technology use, often smartphone use, internet use, that sort of thing, amongst the patients that I see. And one of the things that I've been kind of keying into lately is cognitive changes and behavioral changes that seem to be linked to technology use. And it makes me think a little bit about I'm a fan of the sort of controversial theory of Julian Jaynes, sort of the emergence of modern consciousness and the breakdown of the bicameral mind. So basically, we used to sort of operate with these sort of command hallucinations telling us how to act, and we perceived that as like maybe our gods talking to us, and it just sort of was reflected in the writings of ancient times. And at some point, this sort of new way of, according to Jaynes, this new way of being conscious emerged where people were sort of aware and experienced volition, which we were talking about earlier. One of the things that I wonder about is as I see behavioral changes and cognitive changes amongst heavy technology users, I wonder about cognitive atrophy and underlying that neurological pruning that could be occurring. And if that's occurring, could that ultimately lead to sort of wide-scale changes to electrical signaling in the brain, disrupting the function of consciousness and leading to a breakdown of modern consciousness through the use of these tools, devices, et cetera? And I'd be curious what some of your thoughts were, but that's something I've been thinking a lot about lately. Thank you.
So you're imagining something like, a few hundred years from now, they're writing the history books, and they say, once everyone got BCIs that could talk to ChatGPT, no one had to think their own thoughts anymore, even to move their own arms, and that brought to an end the brief few millennia during which humans were conscious. I hope not. I mean, I'm not hugely persuaded of Julian James's theory in particular, but in terms of atrophy is an interesting phenomenon. I guess I'd have to go back to something I said. I think my fourth thesis. Everything depends as much on politics as it does on technology. The breakdown is one option, but it's maybe up to us to, where us is some ill-defined, imagined collective, to decide if that's what happens.
I would just add that your point about cognitive atrophy is well taken, and it's immediately measurable. So there are plenty of studies showing that increased use of screens, smartphones, et cetera, are interfering with our ability to generate sustained attention. I think we're all familiar with that, just reading in the popular press. And I'm certainly not an expert in this area, so I can't quote precise results from studies, but we can measure attention networks, both subcortically and cortically, their functional connectivity, their interactions with other networks that mediate self-awareness. And so I am sure there are prior studies showing that with increased use of screens and other types of technologies, there are changes in the connectivity of these networks that are statistically associated with decreased performance. So I think there's almost certainly already objective evidence in the kind of neuroscience literature about the phenomenon you're describing. I can't speak to the larger comments about how that's going to change kind of our long-term human consciousness, but I think your point is very well taken.
Luke, if I could ask you a question. Turning the political point, as it were, in the other direction. So you're saying that there's a set of cherished political and moral concepts like agency and intimacy and autonomy that may no longer be relevant for or helpful in thinking about technologies that blur the lines, right, between different minds. Could the importance and the centrality of those concepts in our lives and in our political arrangements and all the interests that are bound up with them and the entitlements, as it were, that are bound up with them, could that be a reason to push back against those technologies?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the kind of interesting things that a lot of this research on like screens and cognitive atrophy suggests is that letting people do more things more easily, at first pass, that seems like an expansion of autonomy. I'm letting you do more stuff. But there does seem to be at least a possibility that expanding what I can do, so I do everything super easily at the press of a button, diminishes certain, higher order features of autonomy. So I'm still, kind of undecided and open-minded about what is the right response. I think it definitely has to involve some willingness to not enthusiastically be an early adopter of every new technology. And I also don't want to be, I don't know, I feel like the word Luddite has become, has been politically contested recently, but there's no point in fighting for something that was unsustainable before just because it was what came before. Ideally, we'd be able to see a new and better future that's enabled by the same technologies that enable the, techno-fascist future we may be drifting into. Maybe, who knows? But I'm still trying to figure out where exactly that looks like.